Everyone laughed at the fisherwoman when she refused to cut loose what hung from her anchor. They called her obsessed and delusional. But when she finally revealed what was attached, the entire coastal town fell silent in disbelief. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The morning fog rolled thick across Saltwind Harbor, turning the water into a gray mirror that blurred the line between sea and sky. Isabella Moreno had been fishing these waters for nearly 22 years, ever since she'd bought her modest trawler with money saved from working double shifts gutting fish at the processing plant. Her boat, the Luna's Promise, wasn't much to look at. The paint had faded to a weathered blue-gray. The engine coughed and sputtered on cold mornings, and the deck bore the scars of countless hauls. Deep grooves where crates had been dragged, rust stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove, patches of epoxy where she'd repaired cracks herself. But it was hers, paid for with sweat, sacrifice, and years of going without. Every plank of worn wood was as familiar to her as the lines on her own palms. She rose before dawn, as fishermen do, drinking black coffee from a chipped thermos while the harbor slept around her in silence. The routine never changed, had never changed in 2 decades. Check the weather forecast on the crackling radio, prep the lines and nets, inspect the hooks for rust, start the temperamental engine with a prayer and 3 pumps of the throttle, and head out past the weathered breakwater into open water. This particular morning felt no different from 1,000 others that had come before it. The air was cool and salt-sharp, carrying the smell of kelp and diesel fuel. The gulls were already circling overhead in anticipation, their cries cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like knives. Isabella guided the Luna's Promise to her usual spot, a rocky shelf about 4 miles offshore where the fish ran thick when the tide and moon aligned just right. Her father had shown her this spot when she was 12 years old, before the cancer took him. She'd been fishing it ever since, through marriages and divorces, through her daughter's childhood and her mother's long decline. The coordinates were burned into her memory deeper than any numbers written in a logbook. The anchor went down with its familiar rattle of chain, the sound echoing across the still water. Isabella settled in to work her nets, the physical labor as familiar as breathing. Hours passed in the rhythmic monotony of hauling and sorting, tossing back the undersized catch with practiced flicks of her wrist, icing down the keepers in the hold below. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over while her mind drifted to mundane concerns. The boat payment due next week, her daughter Sophia's college tuition, the leak in her kitchen ceiling that needed fixing. The sun burned through the fog by mid-morning, revealing a calm sea that stretched to the horizon in every direction, vast and indifferent. It was shaping up to be a decent day, nothing spectacular, but enough to cover fuel costs and put food on the table with maybe a little left over. When it came time to pull anchor and move to another spot closer to the kelp beds, Isabella engaged the winch and waited for the familiar wait and pull, the slight lurch as the anchor broke free from the bottom. But something was wrong. The anchor line went taut as a violin string, the winch motor strained and whined, and the boat lurched violently to one side, causing her to grab the rail for balance. She killed the winch immediately and frowned, her experienced eye reading the angle of the line. Snagged on something, most likely. It happens sometimes. Old fishing nets left behind by careless trawlers, sunken debris from storms, rocky outcrops that shifted during winter swells, even the occasional shopping cart or bicycle frame dumped by idiots from the shore. She tried again, giving the line some slack before pulling, hoping to work it free with a different angle. The winch groaned in protest, the boat tilted at an alarming angle, but the anchor wouldn't budge even an inch. Isabella leaned over the rail and stared down into the green water, shielding her eyes against the sun's glare, but visibility was poor. Whatever had caught her anchor was hidden in the murky depths below, invisible in the shadows. Most fishermen would have cut the line without a second thought. Anchors could be replaced for a few $100s. Time was money on the water, and fighting with a snagged anchor for hours meant lost income, missed tides, and wasted fuel. But something made Isabella hesitate, some instinct she couldn't name. The angle of the line was strange, not pulling straight down as it would against rock or debris, but angled sharply, as though something heavy was suspended from it, hanging in the water column. She grabbed a long gaff hook from the deck box and leaned further over the rail, peering into the water until her eyes began to water from the strain. That's when she saw it. A dark shape, massive and irregular, hanging from her anchor chain like some creature from the deepest trenches. Her heart kicked hard in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system. For a wild moment, her imagination ran free, and she thought it might be a whale carcass or a sunken shipping container, the kind that fell off cargo ships during storms and drifted along the bottom for years. But as her eyes adjusted to the depth and the shadows, she realized it was something else entirely. Something man-made, heavily encrusted with barnacles and trailing long ribbons of kelp and seaweed, but unmistakably built by human hands. The shape was too deliberate, too geometric to be natural. Isabella made a decision in that moment that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. Instead of cutting the line and writing off the loss, she radioed back to the harbor master that she'd be coming in late, possibly very late. Then she set about the painstaking, exhausting work of bringing up whatever hung from her anchor, inch by agonizing inch, adjusting the winch tension constantly to avoid snapping the line. The work took hours. The sun climbed to its peak and began its descent. Her shoulders burned, her hands cramped, and sweat soaked through her shirt despite the cool ocean breeze. Several times the line threatened to snap, and she had to ease off, let it rest, try a different approach. But gradually, slowly, the dark shape rose through the water column, growing larger and more defined as it neared the surface. By the time the Luna's Promise limped back into Saltwind Harbor that evening, word had already spread through the small fishing community like wildfire. Someone with a marine radio had overheard her transmission to the harbor master, and fishermen talk more than they fish. A small crowd had gathered at the main dock, curious and skeptical in equal measure, arms crossed, faces skeptical. When they saw what Isabella was towing behind her boat, a massive, barnacle-covered cylinder of twisted metal barely visible above the waterline, trailing a cloud of disturbed sediment, the whispers began immediately. What in God's name is that thing? Looks like scrap metal to me. Probably an old fuel tank. Whatever it is, it ain't worth the fuel she burned hauling it in. Woman's lost her mind. Isabella ignored them, her jaw set in a stubborn line that her ex-husband would have recognized immediately. With the help of the harbor master's crane and two dock workers who couldn't quite hide their smirks, they lifted the object onto the concrete dock with a tremendous splash. Salt water streamed from its surface in rivers, and chunks of marine growth fell away with wet smacks to reveal heavily corroded metal underneath. It was roughly cylindrical, about 9 feet long and 3 feet in diameter, covered in what looked like decades of underwater accumulation, barnacles, mussels, sea stars, and layers upon layers of rust and oxidation. One end had been torn open violently, revealing a hollow interior packed with more corrosion and what looked like collapsed internal structures. The harbor master, a grizzled man named Dutch Calloway who'd seen everything the sea could throw at a person, scratched his weathered head and squinted at the object. Looks like an old fuel tank, or maybe a buoy housing. You planning to keep this junk, Isabella? Because it can't stay on my dock long term. I am keeping it, Isabella said quietly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Dutch shrugged. Your funeral. Get it off my dock by tomorrow morning, or I'm having it hauled to the scrapyard. The laughter started that very night at the Rusty Anchor, the waterfront bar where fishermen gathered after long days at sea to drink cheap beer and tell lies about the ones that got away. The story spread quickly through the cramped, smoke-filled room. Isabella Moreno had wasted an entire day's fishing, burned through a tank of expensive diesel fuel, and risked her equipment to haul up a piece of worthless scrap metal. The jokes came fast and merciless, fueled by alcohol and the cruel camaraderie of men who'd never quite accepted a woman in their profession. Hey, Isabella, when you selling that treasure you found? I'll give you $10 for it. That's generous. Maybe there's gold doubloons inside. Did you check for pirate treasure? Or, she's probably gonna put it in her living room as modern art. Even the younger fishermen, the ones who usually respected Isabella for her steady work ethic and fair dealings at the fish exchange, couldn't resist joining in. They bought her beers she didn't want and slapped her on the back with exaggerated friendship, grinning as they asked if she planned to retire early on her fortune or maybe open a museum of ocean garbage. Isabella smiled tightly and said nothing, nursing a single beer for hours. She knew how it looked to them. She knew they thought she'd lost her mind, that the loneliness of fishing alone had finally driven her around the bend. But something about the object called to her with a voice she couldn't explain or rationalize. The way it had been weighted down deliberately, not just dropped carelessly. The precision of the metalwork visible beneath the corrosion. This wasn't crude welding or rough construction. Someone had built this carefully, methodically, for a specific purpose. And someone had sunk it intentionally in deep water, far from shipping lanes and popular fishing grounds. Over the next few days, the mockery intensified and spread beyond the fishing community. Her ex-husband Miguel called, having heard about it from his new wife who worked at the harbor office and loved to gossip. Isabella, people are saying you're losing it. You can't afford to waste fishing days on garbage. You're barely making your boat payments as it is. What the hell are you thinking? Her daughter Sophia drove down from the state university that weekend, concern and embarrassment written all over her 20-year-old face. She found her mother in the rented garage behind her small house, hosing down the metal cylinder with a pressure washer, scrubbing at the barnacles with wire brushes and scrapers. Mom, everyone's talking about you. My roommate's parents live here, and they told her you've gone crazy. Even Dad is worried, and you know he never worries about anything. I'm fine, Mija, Isabella said, not looking up from her work, her hands protected by thick rubber gloves. This thing is just scrap metal. You could sell it to Ramirez Salvage for maybe $200. Is that worth becoming the laughingstock of the whole harbor? People are making memes about you on Facebook, Mom. Memes. Isabella finally stopped working and met her daughter's eyes. In them she saw a mixture of love, concern, and that particular embarrassment young people feel when their parents don't behave the way society expects. I don't expect you to understand right now, Sophia, but I'm not letting this go. Sometimes you just know when something matters, even if you can't explain why. Sophia left shaking her head, and Isabella returned to her work with renewed determination. Every evening after fishing, when she could afford to fish, when the weather allowed, when equipment didn't break, she spent hours in the garage, carefully, methodically cleaning the object. Her neighbors began to complain about the noise, the smell of rust and brine, the standing water in the alley. Kids on bicycles would slow down as they passed, pointing and giggling at the crazy fisherwoman and her rusty treasure, making up stories about what it might be. At the marine supply store, the owner Tommy Chun made a show of asking loudly if Isabella needed any polish for her new sculpture. The whole store erupted in laughter, and even the teenage cashier couldn't suppress a smile. At the fuel dock, the attendant asked with exaggerated sincerity if the metal cylinder would be needing its own slip at the marina, and would it prefer regular or premium diesel. Even Isabella's closest friend, Carmen Delgado, who'd fished alongside her for 12 years and stood by her through the divorce, pulled her aside one gray afternoon with genuine concern creasing her face. Jimena, I say this because I love you like family. You're making yourself a joke. That thing isn't worth the embarrassment or the money you're spending on cleaning supplies. Cut your losses and throw it back in the ocean where you found it. People are starting to think you're not stable. But Isabella couldn't explain the certainty that had taken root in her chest, growing stronger each day despite the ridicule. As she worked away the layers of marine growth, scraping and brushing, and sometimes using careful applications of rust remover, she began to see things that others hadn't noticed because they hadn't bothered to look closely. Seams that were too precise and even to be accidental. Threaded connections that suggested the cylinder had once been part of a larger, more complex system. And on one particularly clear section of metal, barely visible beneath the corrosion, what looked like stamped letters or numbers, human markings, intentional communication from builder to future finder. She worked late into the nights, ignoring the deep ache in her shoulders, the cuts and scrapes on her hands from sharp barnacle shells and jagged rust edges, the exhaustion that made her eyes burn. The garage became her sanctuary, the only place where the laughter and mockery couldn't reach her, where the doubt couldn't penetrate. And slowly, painstakingly, with the patience that only a lifetime of fishing can teach, the object began to reveal itself, not as worthless scrap, but as something far more deliberate and purposeful. Something that had been engineered with care and precision, then hidden with equal care in the deep water. The town of Saltwind Harbor had made up its collective mind. Isabella Moreno was a fool, wasting her time, money, and reputation on delusions. They pitted her at best, ridiculed her at worst, and avoided her at the fish exchange. But in the quiet of her garage, under the harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed with age, with her hands black with rust and her clothes permanently stained with salt and corrosion, Isabella felt no doubt. Whatever this object was, whatever secrets it held beneath its rusted shell and barnacled exterior, she would uncover them. No matter how long it took, no matter how many people laughed, no matter how much it cost her in money or reputation. Because unlike them, she had seen something in that deep green water that morning when she'd first pulled on the anchor line. Something that told her this was no accident, no random piece of debris. This was intentional, purposeful, waiting. And Isabella Moreno had learned long ago, through years of working in a man's world and raising a daughter alone, that the most valuable things in life are often the ones everyone else overlooks, dismisses, or is too afraid to claim. The weeks that followed Isabella's discovery settled into a strange, isolated rhythm. She continued her work on the water, rising before dawn as always, guiding the Luna's promise out past the breakwater. But something fundamental had shifted. Where fishing had once been her entire existence, it now felt like an interruption, necessary for survival, but no longer the center of her universe. Her real work waited in the garage each evening. The mockery hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified. At the Saltwind Harbor Fish Exchange, the weighmaster announced her arrival with exaggerated fanfare. "Make way for the treasure hunter. Tell me, Isabella, did your magic cylinder lay any golden eggs today?" The other fishermen would erupt in laughter, slapping their thighs. She'd learned to keep her eyes down, collect her payment slip in silence, and walk out without acknowledging the jeers. Children had made up a rhyme they'd chant when she drove past. "Crazy Isabella, queen of rust, pulled up junk and lost our trust." Their young voices carried through the salty air with thoughtless cruelty. The local newspaper ran a satirical piece titled, "One Woman's Trash Is Still Trash," with a photo of her garage. She'd found a copy in her mailbox with passages highlighted in yellow, a gift from an anonymous neighbor. Her ex-husband's new wife called late at night, emboldened by wine. "You know people are laughing at Sophia too, right? They're asking her if mental illness runs in the family. Is that what you want for your daughter?" Isabella would listen in silence, then quietly hang up, but the words burrowed deep like fishhooks. Even her sister Marta made a special trip from Redwood City. She stood in the garage doorway, arms crossed. "Bella, this isn't healthy. You're obsessing over garbage. Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist? This fixation isn't normal." "I'm not fixated," Isabella replied, voice tight. "I'm investigating something important." "Important? You found trash, Hermana. Please, let this go before you lose everything. Your reputation, your business, your daughter's respect." But Isabella couldn't let it go, because every evening brought discoveries the mockers never saw. She'd fully cleared one section, revealing metal far more sophisticated than simple steel. The alloy was unfamiliar, resistant to rust, and when she'd taken a sample to a metallurgist in the city, driving 2 hours each way and paying $300 she couldn't afford, the results stunned her. Dr. Raymond Kowalski called her back personally, his voice animated. "Mrs. Moreno, this alloy is unusual. Primarily titanium-based, which is extremely expensive, typically used in aerospace or deep-sea applications. But it has trace elements I can't identify. Where did you find this?" "From the ocean floor, about 4 miles offshore, maybe 200 feet down." A long pause. "This wasn't made by amateurs. This was engineered by people with serious resources. I'd estimate 20 to 40 years old, yet it's held up remarkably well." That conversation fueled another week of intense work. Isabella attacked the remaining sections with renewed determination, using wire brushes and chemical rust removers, working by trouble lamplight that cast harsh shadows. Her hands developed new calluses. Her shoulders ached constantly. She lost weight, forgetting meals, subsisting on coffee. But the object was revealing itself. What she'd thought was a single cylinder was actually a complex assembly. There were inner chambers separated by precision machine dividers. Inlet and outlet ports, though corroded. Most intriguing were internal mesh screens made from the same unusual alloy, arranged in a sequence suggesting filtration or separation. One evening, kneeling with a magnifying glass and flashlight, Isabella discovered something that made her breath catch. Stamped into an internal divider, protected from corrosion, was a series of markings. DWP 7//prototype//1987//authorized personnel only. Her mind raced. Deep water purification, or desalination water prototype. This was a prototype, an experimental device someone had been testing. The authorized personnel only marking suggested something official, possibly military or government. She photographed the markings from multiple angles, then started researching. Her old laptop was slow, but the library had decent internet. She spent hours scrolling through declassified documents, patent filings, anything related to water purification from the 1980s. What she found was fragmentary but tantalizing. In 1987, government agencies had experimented with portable desalination systems for military applications. The Cold War was ongoing, and producing drinking water from seawater in remote locations was strategically valuable. There were references to prototypes tested in coastal locations, but many documents were redacted or missing. As Isabella dug deeper, Saltwind Harbor itself began facing a crisis no one had anticipated. It started with complaints about tap water tasting slightly off, a brackish quality that hadn't been there before. The town's water came from wells and a small reservoir fed by coastal streams. For decades, the system had worked perfectly, but that summer was different. Winter rains had barely materialized, leaving the reservoir at 60% capacity by June. Then an unusually hot July pushed temperatures into the 90s day after day. By early August, the reservoir was at 30% and dropping. The town council implemented water restrictions, no lawn watering, shortened showers, limits on business use. The fishing industry needed water constantly, for washing boats, cleaning fish, processing catches, making ice. The restrictions hit hard. Processing plants announced closures. The ice house raised prices 40%. Tensions in the community began to fray. Then in mid-August, the crisis deepened dramatically. One primary well started producing water with elevated salinity, seawater intrusion. Years of overpumping combined with drought had allowed salt water into the aquifer. The well was declared unsafe and shut down. With the reservoir dropping and a major well offline, Saltwind Harbor faced genuine emergency. Remaining wells were pushed to their limits, and within days they too showed saltwater contamination. Tap water carried a distinctly briny taste. The fish processing plants operated on reduced schedules or shut down entirely. The town council held an emergency meeting packed with angry residents. Mayor Victor Brennan stood sweating at the podium. "We're bringing in water trucks. We've applied for state emergency funding. Once winter rains come, we'll recover." "What if the rains don't come?" someone shouted. "What if this drought continues?" The meeting devolved into shouting. People blamed mismanagement, neighboring towns, climate change, bad luck. But blame didn't produce water. Families stockpiled bottled water, buying out every store within 30 miles. Prices tripled, then quadrupled. Elderly residents on fixed incomes simply couldn't afford it. Isabella watched the crisis unfold with growing recognition. She saw neighbors struggling, businesses closing, fear in people's faces. And each evening in her garage, looking at the device with its precision chambers, filtration meshes, and deep water purification designation, she felt pieces clicking into place. She worked with renewed urgency, sometimes through entire nights. The mockery continued, but was drowned out by the larger crisis. People had more immediate concerns. Carmen stopped by one evening, no longer lecturing. She sat on a paint bucket and watched Isabella work. "Finally, what if you're not crazy? What if that thing is actually important? Would you know how to make it work?" Isabella paused. "I'm starting to understand. It's a desalination system, Carmen. Portable, deep water desalination. Someone built this to turn seawater into drinking water." Carmen's eyes widened. "With everything happening in town." "I know. I've been thinking about that." The device wasn't complete. Corrosion had destroyed some components, others were missing. But the core principles were visible. Water entered through the main port, passed through initial filtration, then moved through membranes where desalination happened via pressure-driven reverse osmosis, finally collecting before exiting. The genius was it was self-contained, requiring minimal external power. Water pressure itself created the force needed. If she could restore it or replicate its principles, it could be exactly what Saltwind Harbor needed. As September arrived and the crisis entered its second month, Isabella made a decision. She would stop hiding, stop accepting mockery in silence. Time to show people what she'd found, explain what she'd learned, ask for help. Because this was bigger than her pride. The town was suffering, and she might have found the answer lying forgotten on the ocean floor. The thought terrified her. What if she was wrong? What if it couldn't be restored? What if she failed publicly, confirming every joke? But the alternative, saying nothing while the crisis worsened, was worse than any humiliation. Late one night, sitting with the partially restored device gleaming under work lights, Isabella made her decision. Tomorrow, she would go to the town council, bring her photographs, research, metallurgy reports, explain what she believed it could do. They'd probably laugh, dismiss her as the town joke doubled down. But she had to try, because hidden in that rusted cylinder was something extraordinary, something that proved the most valuable discoveries are often the ones everyone throws away. And Isabella Moreno was going to prove it, or die trying.